Hi, guys. Good morning. Well, afternoon or evening if you're listening to
Depends
us.
on when.
Whatever works for
Be
you.
in the middle of the night.
It's morning for us. Actually,
Yeah.
it's more afternoon. But this
Well,
is
it
Kim.
doesn't matter what time it is for us.
That's true. This is Kimberly and Tim Scott. We're here with Hope Rescue Podcast. Excited to be covering a new series about boundaries. This is a hot topic lately.
Hey, why don't we do a live show sometime? Maybe
I feel
maybe
like
our
that could
producer
go.
will let us do that
I
sometime.
feel like that could go so sideways.
She's kind of laughing like not with what we heard right before you
I
went
mean,
on air.
we have the benefit exactly of editing out. I mean, we pride ourselves on some level of keeping it real, but there's real and then there's transparent.
Yeah. Yeah, well. So let's talk about boundaries.
Yes, we're talking about boundaries. And I kind of want to set the stage because a lot of times there's this crossover between margin and boundaries, right?
Right.
And they're both thrown around a lot. But margin is basically the space you create in your life and your calendar that creates space for you to be fueled, your self-care, your relationships, your body, your soul, and your spirit. And boundaries is the line of defense that you build to create the protection of that margin.
Yeah, I think I think people have a tendency to conflate those two, and so I think
Conflate is a good word.
Yeah, or okay, they make these, they make them synonymous. I'll put it that way.
Oh, that's good.
And
too.
so I think there's a problem with that because boundaries are, like you said, is this defense against people intruding against your margin.
Right.
But the margin is what you decide upon, which some of us who are A-type personalities, what am I, an 8, Enneagram 8?
Yes, 8 and an A-type personality, yes.
And we've discovered just before the show that I'm a jerk.
Well, that's the negative side of being an 8 and a type
So
A.
I can be a kind of a driver, pusher, or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so, I have a hard time setting margin in my own life.
Right.
And also sometimes have a hard time creating boundaries. Like when somebody will tell me they want to meet with me, they have a need, I'm almost like everybody I'll meet with. And I'm learning not to do that.
Yeah.
I've got to stay with what is my job.
Right. And because your temperament is purpose driven, there's so much purpose behind that. So that's why in years past you would run yourself ragged trying to meet the purpose of being instrumental in people's lives in that way. So we've learned to protect our marriage and build margin first, and then to set the boundaries to be able to say the unfortunate word no. And let me tell you this, the only people that push back on boundaries in your life are going to be the ones that benefited from you having none. And that is, we found that to be true.
Healthy people don't push back on boundaries.
They don't, because healthy people understand and probably have their own. But we're all on this journey of health. So if you've struggled with boundaries, I can tell you personally, my whole life, I've struggled with boundaries. I tend to be an empath, and I am more mercy driven, and I'm very relationally driven. So it's hard for me to say no to my own hurt.
Yeah.
And learned in my 40s, I began this process. And then in my 50s, I got so good at it, it makes you uncomfortable.
Wait a minute, you're in your 50s? Wow.
I know, right?
Oh, that's scary. Anyway, well, when we talk about boundaries, we're going to kind of approach this over 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah. For sure, 3 weeks. Talk about, what boundaries and margin are today. Then we want to talk about different kind of people that we have in our lives. Like, for example, everybody talks, not everybody, a lot of people talk about being abused in a relationship when they're not abused. And so the problem with that is when people are talking about being abused, if they're not abused, then the people that are actually being abused are ignored.
Right.
Anyway, we'll get into that next week. And then the following week, we want to talk about how to really resolve this. We've come up with a formula of how to put people in your world in their right space to really understand who you're dealing with. So I really am excited to share that with you. We are excited to share that with you. So we'll kind of get into this, but let's just talk briefly about, taking control of your time and your resources. And that's really what boundaries is about. It's protecting yourself from others intruding, as you read, Kimberly, and it's important for us to set these limits, because what happens is a lot of people are just allow themselves, whoever's the loudest gets the attention.
Sure.
And even with our children, I think mothers are especially given to this, that your children ask for something and you feel that you need to immediately respond to it.
Guilty.
My mom was an expert at going, I'm not responding. She was like I'd go, mom, 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 mom. And then literally go like this, ma.
Oh, that's so annoying.
Yeah, no, I was the annoying kid. That's that A-type personality. Mom, you are going to give me attention.
Acknowledge me.
Anyway,
yes.
so that's that kind of, there are a lot of people that are annoying like
Right.
that, and they're just, they're crying out for attention. And some of those are healthy people and some of those are unhealthy people, and we'll make that distinction. But I was doing a study on high conflict people, HCPs, what we call them. And I came across this resource called High Conflict Institute, and it deals with high conflict people. And I want to read this quote because I think it's important. If this person is a high conflict person, you should be very careful, because high conflict people expect to be treated differently than others. So let me just stop there. If the person that is asking for attention is a high conflict person, they immediately are going to create conflict over their demand for your time.
Right.
And that's a dangerous place.
Yeah.
They will attempt to make a greater demand on you, and if you begin to make exception for them, they will ask for more. So let me stop there again. So what happens with that is, if you give them a little bit of room, that old saying, give them an inch, they'll take a mile.
Park a car in it.
Yeah.
That's what my dad used to say.
What did he say? Park a car? What?
Hey, give a girl an inch and she'll park a car in it. He used to say that to my mom.
I don't even know what that means, but I need to process that. But that does sound like your dad. But this idea that, for a high conflict person, because they're controlling, if you give them a little bit of entrance into your life, people that are unhealthy, people that are toxic in their demands, have a tendency to push in to your life. If you give them a little bit, you've got to be demanding, or you've got to be clear, and we'll talk about how to do that. By maintaining arm distance compassion. I like this. By maintaining arm distance compassion, you will be able to be most helpful for the high conflict person. So the High Conflict Institute, where I got this quote, really deals with high conflict people that are given to drama and, yelling and screaming and demanding and that kind of thing.
Histrionics.
Yeah, some of the histrionics, of course, for those of you budding psychologists out there. But the idea is that there are people that are going to demand, and you're going to have to be careful to put them in their place. So here are some suggestions that we're going to talk about, how we can kind of put these boundaries.
Yeah, we have just a few we've written down. The first one is to be specific about the actual behavior or demand. In other words, you can't come straight out and say, my time's being wasted, because there's nothing compassionate about that, right? Like you're wasting my time. But there are ways to, with compassion, address someone who's toxic like that, or clingy or whatever, and just say, I'm sorry, but I'm not available right now.
Yeah.
Or, I'll email you or text you a couple of dates of opportunities. So you're in control.
Yeah. Did I share this story about the guy that kept talking to me when I'm trying to get away?
Did
I share that story
you did
on
a few weeks ago.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'm getting a nod from everybody. Well, this whole idea that you're sending all the social skills,
right, not catching it.
and at some point you get so frustrated and you just go, you are wasting my time.
Yeah.
Well, at the beginning, you got to be very specific about why you don't have time for that person. So that's what you're saying in that one.
And I don't think you have to go real deep. You just say, I'm not available right now.
Yeah.
I'll communicate with you some opportunities if you want to, or you just say, I'm not available right now, and close the door.
Well, there's a
but you can say it kindly.
Yeah. There are some times where you feel obligated. We're going to talk about this either today or next week. We're going to talk about this idea of no being a full sentence, and this idea that you can say no and you don't always have to give a reason.
Right.
So, but it is helpful if you can give a reason. So if it's somebody that's close to you and you really they're
You're in relationship
like,
with.
let's say you're married to that person and they want your
I'm
attention.
not available right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not no, it's a complete sentence. Bye. Read the hand. Is that out? Because that works.
No, it still
Anyway,
works.
yeah, that still works. So that, it's helpful to say, hey, can we talk in 5 minutes?
Yeah.
You're really good with that.
Yeah.
And, I'm not as good with that. So that's a podcast for another day. And maybe my therapist needs to be here for that. All right. The second thing is use I messages, not you messages. So this is how it feels when somebody says you are doing such and such. You are wasting my time. That feels so much like an attack.
Yeah, it does.
And I struggle with that. I have a tendency to make those kind of clear statements that you're doing this, and it's just not good. It's not helpful.
And just speaking to that specifically, one of the things we have learned, and it's probably been around for a long time in the world of psychology and all of that, but just flipping the script and going from starting with you, reversing that and saying, I feel when you da 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 da.
Yeah.
Instead of saying you did this and this and it makes me feel da da da, you say this is how I feel. So you're owning your own response, reaction, whatever to that. So they are able to say, recognize, okay, so I'm having a part in this, but it's not a blame game necessarily.
Yeah, because if you are in a relationship with somebody and they feel like they're attacked, it's going to diminish the intimacy of that relationship. It's always best to say, I'm doing this is because of what I need to do. Yeah. I need to do this so I don't have time to do this. Usually when you're in a relationship with somebody that's healthy, that they respond well. And what was that quote that you said about people that are healthy when they respond, when you set boundaries?
Yeah, if they're healthy, they totally respect it.
Yeah,
I don't remember what I said.
Yeah,
but,
well, it was a beautiful quote.
Yeah.
I'm going to write it down one day. But anyway, when we're setting boundaries and we're really clear what we need at that moment, people will understand. Yeah. What's the third one?
The third one is I'm going to read this because I don't want to mess it up either. Try to take away his or her fear while setting boundaries. Explain the relationship is not a fit for you at this point in your life. If you focus on his or her shortcomings, you will end up in a debate and the conversation will most likely not go well. Yeah. So you should know that if this is a high conflict person, you might find yourself engaging in a debate. Simply explain that this is not a judgment of him or her, but of your need at this point in your life. Your responsibility is to be clear and not try to force them to understand. That's so key. You may want to say, if a debate takes place, I don't want to get into an argument about this. I'm not rejecting you. That's so key. I'm looking at my need at this moment.
And I can tell you, if you are married to, or you have a child or parent or a sibling that is a high conflict person, it probably is not going to go well.
Right.
No matter what you do. So you have to put your foot down and just say, I have to put a boundary here because I have to do this. There have been so many situations, and we'll get into this when we talk about toxic people, where as a pastor, I've been called upon to kind of intervene into a couple that are struggling with abuse. There have been times where I've actually had to go into a home and remove the abused spouse just to get them out of there for their safety. And because they won't even do it. Now, I don't go against their will. I'm not going to drag them out, but to convince them you need to get out, to clear their head, to get away from that influence of that toxic individual. But it's really hard for them because they're like, I don't know how to tell them to stop. So what do? You just take it. You just keep taking it. Right. Well, you need to learn to set boundaries probably earlier on so that it doesn't get to that point. But let's be honest, many of those abusive relationships have gotten to that point to where the abuser has got so much control over the abused, they can't set boundaries. Right. So it's really that fear is really a big issue. Right. Number 4 is this: give reasonable choices with consequences. That's kind of self-explanatory. Think about this. If you just say we're done. We're not talking. And, that person is just completely shut out. But if you give reasonable choices with consequences, what you're doing is you're developing some options.
Options, exactly.
So
yeah.
I think that a lot of people get hurt over things because it's not communicated to them well. So if you have a reasonable choice, I love what one parent did, and that was put your arm up here, honey. So I don't know if you can see this on camera. Those of you who are listening just to the podcast audio, this woman had a child, probably 3 years old, and I noticed when she was talking to other adults, that child would come and put his hand on her arm and not say a word. And then the mother would reach over and put her hand on top of his hand, but not say anything to him yet. And then the child knows, okay, mom knows I'm here. I don't have to keep going,
so
mom, mom,
good.
mom. And then when she's done, she turns and faces the child and says, what is it, little Johnny or whoever it was? And then the child gets their intervention. And that way they're not disrespecting that conversation. So, so I'm just going to start doing that with you. I'm going to start putting my hand on your... So
You got quite a grip.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do it to you.
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll work. I'll just push you up. No, I won't. I don't.
Wow.
Do that. I don't do that. That went crazy. That was not true. All right, number 5.
So here's the thing. We have to be prepared to enforce our boundaries. This is where it gets challenging for sure. Setting boundaries is useless if it's not enforced, because we all know people who, it doesn't matter the relationship, family, friends, etc. You feel really proud of yourself, pat yourself on the back for laying down a boundary to your children or whatever, and then you basically let it go when they cross it. So it's just an exercise of futility if you're not willing to enforce your boundaries. And for example, I was thinking about this practically. If it comes to a toxic personality, someone that you, even in relationships and family, we've learned that there have to be certain boundaries, and in family and extended family, and negotiating a blended family that has its own nuances. But there are times when we've had to, set boundaries if someone is constantly calling. Or if someone's constantly texting or messaging a friend or, dropping by.
So, okay, let me, my dad, who I swear got up at 4:00 in the morning. Now I'm an early riser, as you know.
Not that early though.
Yeah. I mean, like between 5:30 at the late, like today, 5:30. And, I didn't need to get up other than I just need to get up.
Yeah.
I gotta get up and go. Yeah. So I didn't have any driver other than that. But my dad, who would get up even earlier, when I was a young man, and I had a little family, my small family, and he would call me at 5:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
And go, hey, what are you doing? And then he would always ask, did I wake you up? And I felt so embarrassed. I have to clear my throat before I.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello, Dad.
So
no, I was not sleeping.
This is kind of funny. Maybe it was a generational thing. I don't know, because my brothers tell me that my dad used to do that in their early years of marriage. He did not do it with me. However, I was the daughter married to a man. So, it would have been maybe a boundary there for him, but he felt that free reign. And my brothers did have to step up and say, Dad, you can't be calling this early,
And it's, and then you have in-laws that, show up and stay forever, or you have siblings that, or even children that come over and you go, okay, we need to go to bed, and you guys are still here. It's like lock the door yourself. Yeah. But there are some boundaries. I love this story, and maybe I've shared this before. I don't know. I've done so many of these podcasts, but I was over at a doctor's house. He was one of my best friends, and he was a doctor in this small town where I lived, and his wife and he were just the smartest people. He was very philosophical and knew a lot about just different things, not just medicine, but all kinds of things. He was well read, and I loved talking to him because I was a young pastor and I was in my first church, and I remember we're over at his house, and we would get to talking, and it would go 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. And we lived in the same small town. So my wife at the time would just take the car and go home with the kids, and I'd stay there and talk. And then I would just, walk home.
Yeah.
And it was a mile maybe to our house. And it would get till 12 o'clock or 12:30 on a work night,
Oh
you
my
know?
gosh.
And I remember his wife said one time, she looks at me and she goes, "You probably wishing we would go to bed so you can go home."
I love
I was
that.
like, okay, I think
That's
I've
so
overstayed my
funny.
welcome. And then I started realizing I am just so fascinated by this
Yes.
guy. Maybe I'm standing there. It seemed like he was engaged. And he says, "No, I am engaged." And I would tell you, I'm done when
Yeah,
I'm done.
yeah.
But
You're describing actually in my first marriage, there were no boundaries in protecting the home
Yeah.
life or the family life or whatever. And
even with kids.
yeah, we had people over all the time or living with us. It was kind of a zoo experience, but I was that wife that
Yeah.
I remember, it'd be midnight, sometimes 1 or 2 in the morning, people still be over and I was always pregnant. I've had so many kids and I just would say, I have to go to bed. Good night. But a lot of times they wouldn't even pick up the cue that the wife and the kids are going to bed. They're just hanging
Yeah.
out with
Yeah.
my husband at the time. And it felt like such a, intrusion.
Yeah.
So I'm very sensitive to that. I don't want to be that girl.
Yeah.
And I think though, my mistake that I will own is very early on, I lost my voice in being able to, hold to boundaries, you
Yeah.
set boundaries and to enforce them, which is so important.
Well, I had counseling this couple years ago, and many couples over the years about finances and budgeting and so forth. And I remember this one couple. This is before we had FPU, Financial Peace University, so I had no place to send them. But I'm counseling them how to set a budget and how to stay to the budget and so forth. And he was a spender. She was a saver. She was an investor. He was a consumer. And man, did he like toys. And they had a lot of money, but he burned through their money and got them into big debt. A lot of people with large income can get into bigger debt because they think they can get out of it.
Right.
And they're trying to work their way out of it, but she can't get him to stop because she is afraid to enforce the boundary. They agreed to the budget, and yet he's not sticking to the budget, and she's not putting her foot down. When she did, he'd stop.
Yeah.
So, he goes, "I don't want to be your mother.
Yeah,
I want you to control yourself."
Yeah.
But sometimes people don't have that discipline,
Right.
and you're going to have to set that boundary down. So, number 6 is this: don't use boundary setting as an excuse for selfish living. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing. What I'm saying by that is, and what we want you to understand is that some people use boundaries to get themselves off the hook as far as
Sure.
their own responsibilities.
Right.
So I wrote down a few things. We wrote down a few things that would come to that. And the first one is, I am not giving due to fear. So because I'm afraid, I'm not going to give. And that's what people say. I'm going to set this boundary because I'm afraid of the responsibility that goes with that.
Absolutely. Well, this is not about controlling others. It's about controlling the influences to your heart. And did I jump a point?
Yeah, you
I'm
did.
so sorry.
Just here, number 2.
I
Number
got
2
lost
right
there. The next one was, I'm so sorry, I got derailed. Am I not giving because I'm lazy?
Yeah.
That's actually
So, yeah.
a
So somebody
motivator.
says, I've got a boundary here because you actually don't want to do the work.
right.
So if your boss comes in and says, we got a deadline.
Yes.
We got a deadline at
Yeah.
5 o'clock.
I'm
You
sorry,
have to have
I
that
have a
report.
boundary.
Have a boundary while you're eating, playing solitaire on your whatever people do
video
on their
games.
computers. Yeah. And eating a snack. I've got boundaries, That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about legitimate boundaries. And when you're just
Sure.
lazy and don't want to produce. And then another one is, I'm not giving because of lack of love. So I don't really care about the other person. I don't really care about you. So I'm going to set this boundary. When you really care about people, you want to go the extra mile to meet their needs.
Yeah.
So setting boundaries is no excuse not to go that extra mile.
Right.
you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the next is, am I being pushed beyond my ability to meet the need?
Yeah.
And that's something we can all relate to.
Yeah, I think it's really obvious that some people just are immovable, and they're hard to motivate, and they don't want to respond, and so somebody tries to challenge them, so they throw up the "I got boundaries" issue, and there's a lot of that goes on. So that's kind of a safeguard of abusing the concept of boundaries.
Right. Absolutely. Can I throw this in really quick?
Yeah.
This is why I got turned around earlier. Is I wanted to read the scripture because I think this is what brings those points together. It's Galatians 6:9-10. It says, "Let us not grow weary or fatigued while doing good, for in due time we'll benefit if we don't lose heart. So as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially those in the family of faith, those who are closest to us and that we feel called to." And I say that because in order for us not to get weary or fatigued, we have to set boundaries, even as believers, even if you're a non-believer, in order to not grow weary in the doing well for others, people you love, and even people you tolerate. You need to be able to set those boundaries.
Yeah, and that's perfect for right now, what we're talking about right now. I think some people use boundaries for self-protection instead of really protecting their purpose and their meaning. We're going to get into that. And here's just a safeguard. Let me read this safeguard. This is not about controlling others. It's not about controlling the influences. It is, about controlling influence on your heart. This is living within reasonable tolerances for a healthy and productive life. So reasonable tolerances, what I mean by that is that you are living, it's not that you're not being challenged from where you are, because we all need to be challenged. We need a little bit of stress in our life to produce.
Sure.
And we need to go, the extra mile kind of thing. But those tolerances, when it becomes intolerable, when someone is abusing you, you've got to set those boundaries so that it's really clear. And so here's the bottom line: be clear, be kind, be reasonable. If you want your boundaries to be workable in your relationships, be kind, be clear, and be reasonable. So we're gonna take off for today, but next week we're gonna get into what toxic people look like. How do toxic people? I think we call toxic people that are not toxic.
Well,
And
there's
so
a
we'll
lot of
explain
labels
that. Yeah.
thrown around for sure. So we're going to dive into what that looks like and then how to handle those situations specifically.
So thanks for joining us. It's been great to have you on Hope Rescue Podcast. For those of you who maybe know some people that would benefit from this, invite them to join us. You can just here's a one-stop shop: Hope Podcast, HopeRescuePodcast.org. I almost got that wrong. HopeRescuePodcast.org. Thanks for joining us.
Bye,
We'll see you
guys.
next time.